particularly those vulnerable children. Thank you, Sir.
Oh, Jacinda Ardern.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's my pleasure to speak to the third reading of the Social Housing Reform Restructure and Tenants Matters Amendment Bill. And I do think it's really important at this point, Mr. Speaker, amongst all of the rhetoric that's coming from the government claiming that this is really about helping those who are currently State House tenants and those who may be prospective tenants in the future, that we add a layer of context really to this debate. But always remembering that behind all of the stats that we tend to throw around in this House are ultimately individuals and people with their own stories and their own situations. And I utterly accept that the member across the other side of the House just shared his own. But to what degree do we sometimes forget even the context in which those stories exist? We must remember that only 5% of our housing stock in New Zealand is state house or community housing stock. 5%. That's an incredibly small proportion of housing stock. That is why, Mr. Speaker, that in New Zealand currently 80% of the children who are living in poverty are not living in state or community houses. 80%, a large number of the children that the government claims that it's trying to protect don't actually currently live in those houses. Now, that is not because they are being occupied by rich and wealthy people who are unnecessarily taking state houses. It's simply because the demand is so high and because there are so many children currently living in poverty, 270,000. So when the Minister makes out, as he did in one of his speeches, that, for instance, 4,000 people are currently paying market rents in state houses, so therefore that must be indicative of there being people who don't need state housing being in state housing. Well, I think, Mr. Speaker, that neglects to acknowledge the fact that not everyone in a state house is simply there because of income issues. There are people who live in state houses because they simply cannot get a house in the private rental market for a whole list of reasons. Now, it may in the past have been the case that community housing would pick up that need. Say that you're someone exiting from prison, or you've got another range of issues that mean it's hard for you to find a house in the private rental market. But, Mr. Speaker, I constantly see cases through my electorate office based in central Auckland where individuals are actually coming in because they simply cannot find a house because they, for instance, have a child. No one wants to rent to someone who has a child. And they're renting in a market that is so competitive now that that's the kind of basis on which a private landlord is discriminating against families. So, and the Minister may claim it's against the law. Well, sure. But just like the 90-day job trial, there are a whole host of reasons that people can get sacked from a job without actually getting any explanation, and the same goes for being denied getting a house. It's not that they get told you're not getting the house because you have a child, they just don't get a phone call back. They don't even get a look in. So I'm sorry, Minister Collins, this is the real world and this is the existence that some people are experiencing. And why don't we do something, what about the fact that there are sole parents? How evil of them trying to raise their children on their own and for merely existing. So that is the point that we think that we need to clearly make in this argument, that perhaps we're overstating this notion that there are people in our state houses who don't have those needs. And the other example that I wanted to raise, for instance, Mr. Speaker, is that there will certainly be examples of some tenants who recognise that they're not in the right house. And in fact, I had someone a little while ago now come in to see me at the office where, yes, I am a dirty old list MP, but they came to see me, not the electorate MP for some particular reason, but they came to see me. Now, this particular young woman had been living in a state house with her parents, her sibling, for many years. When her parents tragically died at a very close distance to one another in timing. And so there she was, a very young woman, studying herself, raising now her sibling. She had a particular disability which made it hard for her to find steady employment. Now, she recognised that her and her sibling didn't require the large state house she was in anymore, but it was in central Auckland. And she had asked to go somewhere else, but the lack of state housing options meant that if she left that house, she would be sent to somewhere quite some distance away, up to half an hour away from where she currently was. That meant losing every connection she had in that community. That meant being plucked from her church community, the only neighbourhood she had ever known, and all of her support networks as a young woman now trying to raise a younger sibling. Now that's really, I think, indicative of the issue here, is that National is saying what they're saying. They try and make sound as reasonable and fair, but in reality, reviewable tenancies in a market where there are just not houses available means that actually some of these individuals are just being chucked into a circumstance where finding housing is going to be very, very difficult, particularly in the area where I live. And when we're talking about the fact that we've got 697 fewer state houses last year from this government selling off state houses, and I know in central Auckland they are hocking them off wildly. In fact, there are a number of houses where they just refuse to keep any upkeep going because they're all earmarked for sale. So as much as the Minister talks about the standard of state housing, he's deliberately running down stock with the knowledge that they're simply going to sell it. We also know that there's been a significant reduction in capital contributions to state housing, and that's something that's being brought up by Salvation Army. So yes, amongst all of this debate, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely, Labor could have done more to ensure that the quality of our housing, our state housing stock was kept up. Yep, no denying it. But there's also no denying the fact that when we came into office, National had sold 13,000 state houses. 13,000 state houses. You can hardly blame Labor for at that time being vehemently focused on trying to renew our state housing stock, because there was a massive gap when we came into office at that point. So sure, the government can talk about everything it's done on insulation, fantastic, not denying that that was incredibly important, but it also denies, in doing so, refuses to acknowledge that in amongst all of that, they have been reducing the stock, upgrading what they've got, but reducing the stock overall. So again, the context in which we are debating this bill is a context in which actually we are simply dividing the pie amongst a larger number of people, and the pie is getting smaller. That is why this idea of it simply being common sense to continually review tenancy refuses to acknowledge that actually the environment in which this government is doing it means that people will be in very insecure, unstable situations as a consequence. Now, if the Minister claims that it's absolutely disgraceful to claim that this government would throw out, for instance, well, two groups that we can really easily identify are going to probably be on fixed incomes. Those with long-term disabilities, for instance, who are likely to be on a supported living payment, and, for instance, people who have retired and are on a fixed income in their retirement. You can probably be pretty certain that the circumstances of those individuals are not going to change. If the government is telling us that those individuals are unlikely to be subjected to this bill, why not put it in the bill? If it is ludicrous of us to even suggest it might happen to those individuals, why not put the safe clause into the legislation? Or just accept one of the SOPs that Labor has put forward. The fact that the government has refused to do that, but then tries to tell us that we're scaremongering, it says to me, well, why shouldn't we raise that question? If the government is so defensive about putting it into law, it's only right that we hold some suspicions over what their plans are in that regard. Mr. Speaker, on two of the other larger elements of the bill which we've debated at length, the idea that social housing be subject to income-related rents, absolutely. We are pleased that that is now available. We have some concerns of the pressure that will put on social housing providers, but we will keep a close watch on that. On the second element, MSD providing the assessment or overseeing the assessment regime. Yeah, you can certainly make an argument that that provides some efficiencies, but we will always maintain that unless you put in place the infrastructure and support around first work and income staff to do that job, and anyone who has anything to do with their local work and income office will know the constraints those staff are under, but B, as long as they have the kind of leadership that denies individuals the dignity they deserve when interfacing with those services, we will continue to be very, very watchful of the role that MSD plays in conducting these assessments.
I call Materia Ture.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just want to make